everyone. Thank you for coming today and listening to this podcast. I'm Caroline Allen, your host for today's interview, and I'm so excited to introduce our guest for today, Professor Michael Bronski. Professor Bronski is an American academic and writer best known for his 2011 book, A Queer History of the United States. He has been involved with LGBT politics since 1969 as an activist and organizer. At present, he is a professor at Harvard University and teaches our class on social justice movements, Power to the People. Professor, welcome, and thank you so much for coming today.
Thank you.
Can you tell us a little bit about yourself, when and where you were born, and how you identify in race, sexuality, and gender orientation?
Sure. I was born in New York City, in Astoria, but when I was very young, we moved to New Jersey when I was 3 or 4. I grew up in New Jersey, in the suburbs, and went to college in Newark, New Jersey, which was Rutgers Newark, the state university. That was in Newark. And it was in 1967. So it was a month and a half after Newark had been devastated by the urban uprisings. I actually went to Catholic high school, and it was a very sort of liberal suburban Catholic high school where we were actually given credit for going on civil rights marches if we wrote a paper about it.
That's very progressive.
And we were 1966, yes. And we were encouraged to do work, church-based work in communities, right? Volunteering work in orphanages and old age homes and things. So I really trot my activism back to my Catholic education, as surprised as they may be about that. I'm sure nobody thought I was going to turn out to be a queer activist. And I began going on civil rights marches, and when I got to college, I joined Students for Democratic Society. In 1969, I joined the Gay Liberation Front.
And did your family also have a large role in shaping your political views?
They did. My family, both parents were sort of liberal Roosevelt Democrats, both from union families.
And was your family supportive of your sexual identity?
I wouldn't say supportive. Confused often. They were, we didn't talk about it a lot actually, until later on. We didn't talk about it later on particularly. You know, they were both devoutly Catholic. Mm-hmm. My father, I used to take my father to Mass when he was 98. Both parents were quite devout.
And have you continued with Catholicism?
I have not. I billed myself, I was raised devoutly Catholic, taught Jewish studies at Dartmouth, and am an atheist.
Okay.
But I do think, and I can't emphasize enough, I do think that my early Catholic training did lead me to become an activist in terms of social justice work.
And since activism was such like an integral part of your schooling, was your family supportive of your role as an activist, whether or not they were supportive of...
Oh, yes, completely. Yes.
Okay.
No, they were, I mean, it was the 1960s Catholicism of a certain mainstream American Catholicism was very much about, because it all came out of immigrant. Catholicism is essentially an immigrant religion to a large degree, Irish and Italian or Polish. And, they're all union workers. They're all Roosevelt Democrats.
Okay. And
my parents were, for the time and for our neighborhood, were actually extremely progressive about race. Right. I remember when I moved to Boston in 1971, and I was involved with Gay Men's Liberation here. We actually wanted to support the Black Panthers. That we 5 of us went out to Roxbury to a Black Panthers headquarters, and these women came to the window of the second floor and said, "What?" We had like five obviously gay white guys with long hair. She said, "Yes," and we said, "We just wanted, that we support the Black Panthers, anything that we can ever do, and we're happy to give you money." And she said, "Oh, great, fine." But there's no hostility.
Right.
I mean, I don't know what we thought we were going to do, and I don't think she knew what we were going to do.
And where do you think your feeling of support for the Black Panthers came from?
I think it came from high school. I think it came from the slow evolution of, the slow evolution of actually getting involved with anti-war protests in high school, mm-hmm. right? And seeing what we now call call intersectional, which we didn't exist back then, an intersectional way of looking at politics, right? So for me, pretty much brought up on in the media and at home to some degree, right? Traditional civil rights strategies, Martin Luther King and NAACP, or the Black Panthers seemed the obvious progression of that when you began to look at the other things that were going on in the country, working against the war in Vietnam, working against what seemed to be an increasingly corrupt government. So the Black Panthers, which and it was hard to avoid the Black Panthers because they were literally in the media in negative ways, right from the very beginning. So it wasn't like I wasn't aware. I was aware, and it made perfect sense that this was the evolution, or certainly a evolution, or could exist simultaneously with other civil rights struggles.
And did you have any interactions with Black men that were part of the gay liberation movement that were also members of the Black Power movement?
Sure. Not in New York so much, when they were actually so the New York Gay Liberation Front, as we saw in class, was pretty chaotic. And I was also, I had just turned 20. Unbelievably, I was actually very quiet. And GLF was filled with really, really noisy people.
Interesting.
Who were showboating a lot. So it was hard to even get a word in. It was racially mixed, right? But I didn't actually know. I knew a few people. I didn't know a lot of the people. I certainly didn't know the people who talked all the time, because they were too busy talking all the time, right? But when I moved to Boston, there were multiple members of the Gay Men's Liberation GML who were African American or Latinx, and who had been involved before gay liberation with aspects of Black Power.
Okay. And so do you think that being in this sphere, you had a sense of what intersectionality meant before it was really defined?
Completely, yes. And I think right, and I think you see that in the readings we've done for class. You see that in Carl Whitman.
Right.
Clearly, right? You see it, and interestingly, you see it much more in gay liberation than you did in radical feminism or Black Panthers, right? Because the Black Panthers were literally fighting for their lives and trying not to be murdered by the police. Women's liberation, the radical feminists, right, were really attempting to define themselves against a violent male society, and what gay liberation did, right, was that it actually took people from Black Power, took women from radical feminism, right, took women from radical lesbians, right, and they brought those politics with them into the new group, right. So almost everybody in the gay liberation front and in GML in Boston, right, had experience in many in labor unions. Certainly, everybody had experience in anti-war movements and peace movements, right? Many people had been members of Students for Democratic Society, which was attempting to actually remake American society, right? So that coalition, right, from the late 50s to the 70s was called the New Left, to distinguish it from the Communist Party left, right? So that as people from those movements came into gay liberation, right, it became more obviously manifest that there were connections and intersections.
Right. And do you think the perspective in gay liberation, like the perspective of Carl Whitman's in a gay manifesto, do you think that strengthened the whole gay liberation movement? And do you think that a more intersectional point of view would have strengthened the Black Power movement, or do you think that it would have detracted from their main goals?
It's interesting, right? At the end of this, I may do it this year too. At the end of this class, I always used to ask for one of the final questions: if you could build a time machine and go back in time to a meeting of the Panthers, of the Radical Feminists, or Gay Liberation Front, and said, "I'm from the future. I want to tell you what you could have done better," what would you tell them? Right? And almost everybody says, "Oh, they should be more intersectional." And my question is, concretely, what would you tell the Black Panthers to do to be more intersectional? Would it be they are addressing poverty, they're addressing class, they're addressing economics, they're addressing political structures. They're not addressing white people's problems,
Right.
nor should they.
No, no.
They weren't particularly very good about African American women.
Right.
Although they do actually, if you look at they were giving away food, which is normally the traditional woman's role to cook food in the home, right?
Right.
They were doing things.
They were just, you could say they were stuck in their time and that they didn't see leaders like Elaine Brown as powerful and someone to respect.
And let's not forget that Elaine Brown is in a position because her boyfriend put her there.
Right.
I mean, as brilliant as she is and as powerful as she is, the Black Panthers didn't vote for Elaine Brown. And if you look at radical feminists, right, they actually do say we speak for the most oppressed women in the world, except they're all white Ivy League educated feminist women who don't seem to have much to do with them. So they have an inclination to thinking intersectionally, but they don't really implement it very much. At least in gay liberation, right, people had a sense of it being somewhere that we should think about, and we're finding ways to actually implement it in everyday politics.
So, a question for you. If you could go back to your activist self in 1969 from the future, what would be your advice for yourself as an activist?
I would say, so we saw in the Black Panthers a lot of fighting, infighting, and we saw in the radical feminists a lot of infighting among women, right? And that was also present in a lesser way in gay liberation, but there was competitiveness, there was pettiness, as I'm sure there is on the women's hockey team at Harvard, or the men's rugby team, or the Phi Beta Kappa selections, or any dorm room after 12 o'clock at night, right? I would go back and say people should be kinder to one another. There were probably ways to work out differences that did not entail cutting somebody off.
Do you feel that there was a cancel culture in those movements?
Oh, in all the movements, yes. Oh, completely, yes.
More prevalent than today?
Very different, because radical feminists could cancel one another, but there were only like 50 of them.
Right.
And nobody in the larger world really cared that Betty Friedan didn't like T. Grace Atkinson, because T. Grace Atkinson liked Valerie Solanas' book, right? In gay liberation, right? There were major political disagreements, right? I mean, one clear one that people always refer to, right, is that in New York, the Gay Liberation Front had very little money. You got money from dances, and people donated money, right, to print posters or flyers. Right, before you could actually send out to 5,000 people on one email or a text, right? And the Gay Liberation as a group voted majority, not consensus, majority, to give some money to the Black Panthers, of which there was very little money. And members of the group completely disagreed, because they felt did not make sense to support a group that was not gay, and that many perceived as homophobic in some ways, completely reasonably, given the Eldridge Cleaver book, right? And that was a major, major rift. Like, people stopped talking.
Do you remember your perspective on that issue at the time?
Give money to the Panthers.
Yeah?
Yeah. I was in the radical caucus, right?
Right.
So the people that left were the people that formed the Gay Activist Alliance.
Right.
To do more. And there's nothing wrong with doing more targeted political work in a field, to do specific things like get somebody elected, or pass an anti-discrimination law, or pass an act that says that you cannot discriminate in housing at all, right? They're just very different struggles, right? I mean, famously, right, the Black Panthers were not doing what Martin Luther King was doing, and I'm sure he did not like the Black Panthers as a concept,
right?
And so it was actually ruining his party,
And they didn't love him.
They didn't love him at all, right? He was, holding people back. And that happened in gay liberation as well, for the most part, right? But I think it was hard at that point to see that both of those political impulses were useful. And there was no need to cut people off because they were doing one thing and not the other, right?
Right.
I mean, and actually there was very little. There were, of course, tensions in gay liberation groups about, class differences and sometimes race differences, but less than that, right? But there were really no differences about sexual behaviors. Everything was accepted. Nobody was ever called slutty.
That's new.
Yes. Nobody was ever put down for what it was rumored they had, I mean, if somebody treated their boyfriend badly, they would say, that was really shitty to do that to Lewis. But that happens in the nicest suburbs in America with straight people.
Right.
So anyway, if I were to go back, I'd say, try to take a step back and see the bigger picture and make a little bit of room for people having divergent views, yes.
Okay. And taking from your perspective as both an activist and a historian, to what degree do you think the Black Power movement really pushed for rights for Black people in the U.S.?
I think, well, we've discussed this in class, right? If you look at the list of what we want and what we believe, almost none of it happened. There are not all Black juries. Black men are not exempted from the military. The only thing that maybe happened was that we ended the war in Vietnam. But obviously, we're in the middle of two major national trials going on, both that deal with race in some way, in very contentious ways, right? The Kyle Rittenhouse trial and the Aubrey Ahmaud trial, right? So I think that the Black Panthers' agenda actually didn't really happen, but what the Black Power movement did was that it opened up huge amounts of spaces, cultural spaces, and political ways of thinking politically. And I think each of the movements did this, right? So I can remember being in college, it must have been 68, and I had a teacher named Tom Weatherly, who was part of the Black Arts movement. He lived in Newark, New Jersey. And he came to class one time speaking about Black Power and culture, right? And he brought a bag of frozen food that was labeled soul food, meaning for Black consumers, right? And he said, I want to discuss how we got to the point where it's a political statement to buy frozen macaroni and cheese with an image of a militant Black man on it. And that's what made me think about culture.
Okay, so we would say that to you, the Black Power movement, its largest importance is almost a cultural shift in the country.
Shift, right? But once you have that cultural shift, you then allow all kinds of other political things to happen. Right? I mean, in some way, the best thing a movement can do is cause a cultural shift, because for the most part, immediate demands will take years, if not decades.
Right. And laws often follow culture.
Yes, almost all the time, right? And laws are not always fair.
Okay, and what are some of the largest differences you see between the Black Power movement and today's Black Lives Matter movement?
Well, I think
in terms of motivation, right. I suppose.
So I think that anything that happens dealing with race in the country can only happen now because of the Black Power movement. So Black Lives Matter is actually completely and totally indebted. Yeah. So, but they have similar visions in the sense that they both want to save Black lives. They have similar visions that they both think Black is, to use the phrase back then, Black is beautiful. They both want to empower Black women and men, or Black people, right? I think because the Black Power movement, particularly the Black Panther Party, was specifically Marxist and hierarchical, that in many ways Black Lives Matter is the antithesis of that, right? It is literally a grassroots movement that has no clear leadership, right? And if in fact the Black Power movement, particularly the Panthers, right, took the Marxist notion that you should ignore the lumpen proletariat and embrace the lumpen proletariat, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think in many ways, which we saw in the Patrisse Cullors book, when they call you a terrorist, right? That literally the Black Lives Matter movement has embraced everybody in a sense, in a way beyond what the Panthers were able to do.
And do you think the decentralized structure of Black Lives Matter is a direct response to disagree with the Black Power movement, or do you think it's rather a response to like larger cultural shifts that have come out of all three liberation movements?
I think it's a response to the other movements, but I think primarily it's a response to technology,
mm-hmm.
and it's a response to social media, and the way we communicate with one another these days. That was simply not even conceivable back then, right?
Inconceivable.
Yes, I mean it was simply that you simply, if you were in Radical Feminism in '67 or Black Panthers in '66 or Gay Liberation, you would actually, we didn't have a Xerox machine, we had a mimeograph machine, right? The notion that you could actually do activism using email and then tweets and then blogs was not possible, right? So even when you look at the gay movement, right, you look at ACT UP, the movement to battle AIDS discrimination and the horrors inflicted on people with AIDS, right? They had access to email at some point, which was a revelation.
And on that note, do you think that digital activism has contributed to the influence of BLM and do you think that this has been only positive, or in some ways negative?
I think, I think in some way, I think that's not the right question, right? In some way, I think it's been enormously positive because it's allowed so much more to happen. I know people argue, I know Elaine Brown argued, right, that in fact, because she's a committed Black Panther person, that the decentralization means it doesn't do anything, right? That everything gets watered down. It seems to me that rather than view that as hurting the movement, it might be more productive to think of ways in which social media can be improved upon to help the movement.
Do you have any ideas?
I have no ideas because, as you've seen in class, I can barely work my phone.
Okay.
I need it. Curtis has to actually do the computer for me.
And do you think that, based on right now, Black Lives Matter has had more of an influence on the country overall? And if not, does it have the potential to have more influence?
It has enormous influence, right? But I think as with the Black Power movement, right, and with most movements, the influence is not necessarily political in a predetermined agenda sort of way, but it's cultural influence, right? I mean, same is true of Me Too, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the amount, really, I think it's useful to think of societies being sort of in a hermetically sealed, which of course we know it's not, but think of it as a hermetically sealed space, and what these movements do is that they create space within them. Right? And once you open that space, right, you can't control what happens in it, right? So we discussed in class, right, that I would argue that the movie like Shaft was only possible because of the Black Power movement, even though people in the Black Power movement itself may not like the movie, or certainly people in the NAACP felt it was not a good image. Right? I mean, gay liberation opened up a space, and that allowed, everything from the movie A Very Natural Thing to RuPaul's Drag Race. It's a mistake to think that everything that happens in that new space is useful or positive or even productive or even good.
Mm-hmm.
But it's a dynamic that keeps changing.
Okay. And we have one final question for you today. And that is, what do you see for the future of Black Lives Matter? And how can the community engage to best bring the goals of this movement to fruition?
Well, I think, part of it is not despite the fact that I may be the only person who got who taught at two Ivy League schools because he was asked to join them, not who applied for a job even. As a white academic at the elite institution, it likes to think of itself. I'm not sure that I have a lot to say about that.
Mm-hmm.
Certainly, as somebody who thinks and writes about history, it's an ever-evolving movement that has actually caused so much consciousness raising. It is one of the most effective consciousness raising groups in the past 50 years. I'd say more so even than Black Power and radical feminism, gay liberation, just because of social media.
Right.
Yeah. The future, I think, depends on how people use social media and depends on how things evolve.
I'm joined here now to reflect on the interview you've just heard with my two co-hosts, Olivia Johnson and May Weston. Welcome, and thank you guys for joining in.
Thank you, Caroline.
Thanks so much, Caroline. I wanted to start by emphasizing what a transformative time it was when Professor Bronski was going through college. He mentioned that he attended university in Newark just 6 weeks after the city had been hit by urban uprisings that swept across the city after the death of MLK.
Yes, and we can trace this back to our discussions in class about the post-Vietnam War political and social climate in the country.
You could say it was a moment of tension and anticipation for the revolution of sorts that manifested itself in the Black Power movement and the gay and women's liberation movements.
And on that note, I found it very interesting how we saw this cultural shift, even in Professor Bronski's Catholic education, which I would have thought to be more conservative than how he described it.
The discussion on the role of his high school in influencing his trajectory as a gay rights activist really changed my perspective on the role of religion in people's lives at the time.
I, too, found it interesting that his family's Catholicism had roots in activism and his school taught an intersexual way of looking at politics, and that most people during the time recognized the corruptness of the government as a unifying factor and made space for free political thought and discussion, even in schools.
And this all stands to contradict Malcolm X's claims on the role of Christianity in brainwashing the people to stick to the status quo.
Totally agreed. Also, Caroline, you mentioned intersectionality, and Professor Bronski had a lot of interesting things to say about the levels of intersectionality in the movements you discussed. Can we talk a little bit more about that?
Yes, Professor Bronski explained that the LGBTQ activism, the gay liberation movement, radical lesbian feminists, etc., and Black Power movements didn't collide per se, but they were definitely in conversation with one another. Half of the gay liberation movement was in favor of supporting, financially or otherwise, the Black Power movement, specifically the Black Panthers, though the other half opposed it.
I think this opposition may have stemmed from an assumption of homophobia. Take the obvious homophobic and sexist ideologies in Eldridge Cleaver's Soul on Ice, for example. It really emphasizes the thought that the Black Panthers weren't specifically a gay organization. And the fact that these two groups of highly intersectional people struggled to collaborate with one another perhaps was, I guess, the manifestation of the effects of them both existing in a white supremacy and heterosexual-based society. That these two groups were epitomizing the two extremes of the society they were living in, that being Black and being gay. They were the most outcast.
I think also that the resistance to this so-called collision from those in the gay liberation movement parallels the historical resistance against anti-white supremacist narratives, policies, etc. in this country. For example, slavery, integration, mass incarceration, up until the Black Lives Matter movement of today, and the uprising of counterculture in response to it. In class, we talked a little bit about the prominence of a counterforce that would come forth in response to radical opinions and movements, which we see occurring in each of these social movements.
Professor Bronski does say the Black Panthers were an obvious progression of MLK and the previous civil rights movements. I think that among other activist spheres, the Black Power movement was defined by the Black Panthers and held high levels of credibility, being comparable to MLK and the civil rights movement as opposed to degenerate militant young people.
The comparison being that they could coexist with several other civil rights movements, that being the early budding of truly intersectional social movements.
It's also important to remember that the gay liberation movement was racially mixed, and Professor Bronski had interactions with Black men and women who were members of the Black Power movements as well as the gay liberation movement, providing an early sense of intersectionality, specifically for Professor Bronski.
Exactly. He said the gay liberation movement took the feminists from the radical feminist and radical lesbian feminist movements, people from the Black Power movement, and those people brought with them their politics, and these intersections became visible when they came into the gay liberation movement.
And Bronski mentions Carl Whitman's writings, which puts a further emphasis on the importance of intersectionality as these movements grow and still continue to grow.
I think this is relevant also to the discussion on cancel culture. The one piece of advice Professor Bronski wished he could go back and tell people in the movement was to be kinder to one another. It's important today to remember that in spheres with intersectional people, there are not many other places to go if people start canceling each other. Sometimes that sphere is one of the few things that you have. Divisions within these communities hurt the progressions of the movements. And as Professor Bronski put it, people on the outside of these organizations didn't really care if one person didn't like the other.
And this goes back to the notion of Carl Whitman's idea of group progression. If we all don't move together, none of us can truly progress.
Maybe if greater acceptances of differences had been present, the impact of the Black Power movement on opening up spaces for change could have been even more significant.
This is very true. And as Professor Bronski explains, the Black Power movement did create a huge cultural shift. So this cultural shift started changing social norms and opening up this political space that enabled the catalyzation of further human rights movements later on.
He also talks about how he believes that blaxploitation movies, for example, regardless of how hated they were by the Black Power movement, they could not have happened without the movement.
Exactly. And the movement's impact on culture at the time translated to a shift in political thought, as I mentioned in the interview. Cultural shift is needed first to bring about legislative change down the line.
I think this is a very good moment to bring up the progression of the Black Power movement into what we now see as Black Lives Matter. As Professor Bronski states, the Black Power movement was rooted in Marxist and hierarchical ideology, and Black Lives Matter is the antithesis of that.
I think today we talk a lot about Black Lives Matter as an evolution of the Black Power movement, but we don't always emphasize what Professor Bronski mentioned, that we learned a lot from the certain mistakes from the Black Power movement, such as the lack of intersectionality present in that movement that we've already talked about, and that we brought these learnings from the Black Power movement into the Black Lives Matter movement.
Yes, and the influence that Black Lives Matter has had is broader than that of the Black Panthers / the Black Power movement as a whole, largely due to social media, as mentioned by Professor Bronski, but also due to the fact that Black Lives Matter chose to take an intersectional approach. And as Professor Bronski states, Black Lives Matter is the most conscious-raising group because of social media and that intersectionality.
Yes, and we see that this influence is both cultural and political. For example, after the Black Lives Matter protests during the summer of 2020, we saw the relatively quick implementation of anti-racist trainings in the workplace and discussions about intersectionality and race in spaces that, those topics weren't ever welcomed for discussion before.
Ultimately, one thing we can take away from this interview is looking at the progression, not only of the social movements, but also of the people that participated in each movement.
Agreed. I think it's so important to reflect on the fact that a lot of the young people that led the movements of the 1960s and 70s who are still alive today are in professional fields such as academia, politics, and positions of power. Though back then they played the primary role of activists, today, being in positions of power, they may have more influence and the ability to bring the demands of the movements of today into fruition.
Yes, in other words, the first and last steps of the cycle of social and political change, that being, first starting with activism, going to consciousness raising and opening up spaces, and then that leading to further political and legislative change and action down the line, that is now influenced by the people who lived through those movements back then.
Great point, Olivia. And with that, I believe we are out of time. Thank you both for such an amazing dialogue. For anyone listening, make sure to catch us on our next episode, exploring more about the progression of the Black Power movement and the role of Black Lives Matter in today's culture.
We will see you next episode.
Thanks for listening, guys.